Thank you. Wow, it is so good to be back in Charleston. I cannot tell you how much I've missed it, and I plan on being back here frequently. And I hope we're going to have these meetings. But this one is a special meeting because the person we have as the final speaker tonight is an old friend of mine. I remember this gentleman when I helped him when he was running for Congress for the first time. And the then governor of New York, I got involved, Pataki, and we had a little event from New York. Do you remember that? And anyway, and he is a major player on the world scene as well as the national scene. But before we begin, I wanted to keep you up on all the news, and you know I like to do that. Now understand, I just flew over last night. Okay. Now, I don't know if you know this, but according to a new report, Nigeria owes New York City over $500,000 in unpaid parking tickets for its foreign diplomats. Nigeria did apologize for that, and they said that they'll pay the fines right away if we send them our bank account numbers, our PINs, and our mother's maiden name. It was a long flight over. Tonight, our first speaker, we're pleased to welcome. She's chair of the Charleston County School Board of Trustees, and she's going to brief us tonight on a $500 million referendum for more school buildings. It gives me a great deal of pleasure to welcome, for the first time, Cindy Coates. Cindy, come on up.
Thank you.
It's all yours.
Thank you. Hi. Yeah. Let's talk about the $500 million tax referendum. There is a proposed tax extension that would be on the November ballot. Okay. And it has a list of 35 projects. The same thing was done in 2010. There's a projection that will collect around $73 to $77 million a year. That's projections not done by our district officials. I don't necessarily trust them to give us those numbers. And so we've created a list that has about $490 million worth of projects with a contingency down below of some extra projects. We did this in 2010. And the projections have come back in that we'll end up with $470 million from that tax. We will have built every single project on the list that was on the referendum for that tax. The unique thing about this is that it will be on your ballot, so you will see the list of projects and decide whether that is something you would like to see built or not. Our latest data from COG is that we are growing at a rate of around 5% in population. There is roughly 100 people moving into Charleston County every day. And if you live near Mount Pleasant, you know we cannot continue redrawing attendance zone lines. There's simply more kids than there are desks. That's how it works. But I was asked to come and explain any questions that y'all may have today, and I'll be glad to answer any questions.
Okay.
Yay.
Let's take some questions. First question.
Okay. Cindy, could you tell us if there's been an audit done, a forensic audit, to find out about waste and abuse of money? I know there was an article in the Post and Courier last year about $425,000 that was spent on 5 unopened, unused schools.
There's two things in your question. Number one, when we created the 2010 ballot, the very first thing that we went out and did is we went to the mayors and leaders of every municipality and said, give us a list of your most brilliant, articulate, volunteer people. We have the CFO from Roper St. Francis, the CEO from South Carolina Fed. We have a citizens oversight committee that reviews these. Interestingly enough, when we got 2 years into it, the citizens oversight committee, which is independent of us, came to us and said, we think it's a good idea to have an audit done, and the audit came back very clean and excellent. The $425,000 on the unopened schools, we are required by insurance to keep those schools with power, alarm systems. I'm a sell, baby, sell kind of chick. If we're not using it, I'd love to sell it, but that's where that money is.
Question. Stand up. I'm holding. I don't give it up. You may run off with it.
All right, Cindy, Dorchester District 2 has a school impact fee of $2,500 per home. Has any thought been given in Charleston County to having a school impact fee for new homes so that the people moving in can share in the cost of the school construction?
No, we've looked at it, we've thought about it, but right now as it stands, our board is not really interested in doing that. And the board as a whole operates, that's been discussed, but minimally at best, and not something that's gaining any traction with the board members.
Yes, ma'am. I read a snippet about 12 libraries being built this year, and is that part of the list that you just mentioned? And can you explain what those libraries are?
Sure. The Charleston County Library System is also asking for a tax to be put onto the ballot to build libraries totally independent and separately from the school district. They're not our buildings. We don't operate their buildings. That's completely separate.
Yes, I have a question. I'm in state education policy, and I'm wondering about the vote that was taken regarding the McClellanville High School. You know, at the state level, it is difficult to finance a school where you have 150 students, and that's at the elementary level. High schools are very expensive, and my question is, what's the merit of the vote to have a school in McClellanville for 129 students?
That is an excellent question. Unfortunately, in the interest of full disclosure, I'll tell you that I did not vote to support that measure. I believe that in Charleston County, we have something that does not exist anywhere else in the state of South Carolina, and that's a constituent district. And that is basically the federal government came in 1968 and said, we're going to combine your district into one. We're going to draw constituent districts to allow you to continue to have what you consider local control. We're going to set this entire thing up, and then we're going to give the authority of that to the state government. And so there is a lot of questions and concerns on whether can we build a school in District 1 and have students that technically live in District 2 go to that school? Can we build it further down and cross those constituent district lines? And I think that anything that was created in 1968 ought to at the very least be considered before we start building a school that can't have children from Mount Pleasant go up to it. But we definitely need to build 3 high schools between the Cooper River and the Charleston County line. I just think we need a little more studying and a little more input on how we can do those district lines with the constituent boards. And you're going to boot me off the stage.
I'm going to boot you off the stage. Thank you so much. Okay, I don't know if you've been following what's going on with the Secret Service. Again, trying to keep you up on the news. The director last week submitted her resignation. You all saw that, right? And you know how she did it? She jumped the fence, ran across the lawn, dove through a window, and handed it to the president. But that's not the real story. The real story is, I swear to you, the Secret Service now maintains that they can use lethal force to stop someone from entering the White House. Lethal force. That's fact. So you know what President Obama immediately did? He invited the Republican leadership over for lunch. You like it, right? Every once in a while, we come across somebody who is truly a leader, a person who actually can be a major force, who is a major force, can be even a larger force in coming days, months, years. She's a regular at our meeting. She's director of the South Carolina Department of Health and Environmental Control. In this role, she's been extremely effective at cutting back big government and saving money for the taxpayers of our state. Tonight she's going to tell us how unelected government bureaucrats drive up government waste and what we can do about it. Catherine Templeton, come on up.
wasn't sure who the next speaker was when he started speaking. And my fellow unelected bureaucrat, you know, Governor Jindal used to be in the cabinet as well. So as we ache for this responsible, transparent, and responsive government, we're quick to use words like politician and government employee in a negative way. But let's all agree that the absolute ugliest word you could call somebody is an unelected bureaucrat. So I stand here tonight to tell you, as an unelected bureaucrat, that we are the ones you should care about the most. We are the ones you should pay attention to the most. Ronald Reagan used to have a saying that personnel is policy. And what he meant by that was, in order to effectuate the policies of the president, you had to hire people who both supported those policies and had the ability to get those outcomes. But that's who's running your government. It's not the elected officials. It's not even the political appointments. We have seen what unelected bureaucrats can do. I think Mallory just gave us an example in the Secret Service. That was an unelected bureaucrat. In the IRS, that was an unelected bureaucrat. In the Health and Human Services Department, they couldn't even get a website up. That was your unelected bureaucrat. But think about it in the context of war. In a war, the outcome that you want is to win. Quickly, without breaking the national treasury, and with as little harm to life as possible. But victory requires strategy, deployment of resources, knowledge of the landscape, and experience at shooting and at being shot at. So who do you want in charge of your soldiers? President Obama? A congressional subcommittee on how to create regulation to inform our boys and girls on whether to shoot or duck? No. You want generals. You want the generals. A swift victory with minimal damage comes from the generals. You want the generals to be given a resource, parameters, and a direction. And then you want the smartest, most experienced, most wily general that you can find. Our government is failing because the executive branch of government is full of unelected bureaucrats that are not generals. The chief executive officer hasn't managed. He hasn't had to meet a budget, and he hasn't had to use common sense to deal with the very real administration of government. We have to have experienced business people running the daily, practical, outcome, critical services that support this country and this state, and those people need to have intelligence and common sense. They have to be able to know where to cut, where to fund, and they have to create better outcomes for our citizens. Now, 20 years in the private sector, after working in manufacturing, doing management consulting, and as a lawyer fighting labor unions, it was quite a departure for me to go into government when Governor Haley was elected. I didn't have a relationship with Governor Haley when she asked me to serve as her labor secretary during our state's fight with the National Labor Relations Board over Boeing. But to her credit, and why these elections matter, she recognized the need to put someone in that position with practical experience facing off against the NLRB and the unions. I stayed at the Department of Labor for a little over a year because that was all it took to beat the unions and reform the agency. In that year, I was personally charged by the NLRB. The governor and I were sued in our official capacities and individual capacities in federal court, and Boeing was pulled into a fight because it wanted to create non-union jobs in South Carolina. At the end of the year, the NLRB had to drop its charge against me. The federal court told the union that Governor Haley and I were right, but the Boeing suit got settled while keeping our non-union jobs here. But we had also managed to reform the actual business of the Department of Labor, which is in charge of regulating every single solitary profession in this state except for lawyers. We cut 25% of the fixed costs, returned millions to the taxpayers, cut fees, stopped operating programs so the private sector could take over, put licensing online, testified in hearings to deregulate entire professions, and we did it all while measurably increasing customer service response time from 24 minutes to 32 seconds with the resources that we had. Then I got a call from the DHEC board because they said they wanted a reformer. They'd recently turned over, and they were made up of successful business members that were appointed by Governor Haley. DHEC is the largest, most complex agency in the state of South Carolina with a $600 million budget, 3,600 employees, and well over 100 locations statewide. No other state in the nation organizes their programs like we do. That should tell you something. Everybody else has 4 for our 1. It's a monstrosity. So we took over DHEC. We had 10 layers of management, no central leadership. We were running a deficit, and we weren't administering the programs we were required to by law. I'm trying to talk fast because there's so much. In the first 18 months, we saved $68 million. We refused $10 million in federal tax money. Tens of million, not 10. It was actually 67 million. We're now getting our environmental permits out the door 40% faster, but they have integrity because our appeals haven't gone up. We survived the federal government shutdown and sequester. We hired more boots on the ground to serve you, and we've done it without asking the General Assembly for one dime. As much as possible, government should be run like a business, but it doesn't happen. And it took me a while to figure out which 3 examples I wanted to give you, but let's start with this one. Government makes promises like businesses do, and they should be held accountable for those promises. The Department of Energy promised South Carolina that it would clean up the #1 environmental threat to this state, which is high-level hazardous waste at the Savannah River site. The federal government has missed so many deadlines and ignored its responsibility for so many years that waste now sits in decaying tanks that were not intended to still be around. And the tanks are sitting in groundwater. Do you remember Fukushima? That's what happened. And we've had 2 earthquakes in Aiken in the past 6 months. In the last year, no one has ever taken them to task. No one's ever made them be accountable. They've just let the deadlines go and go. And this year, even though they promised to clean up their mess, they didn't bother to ask for enough money in their $5 billion budget to clean up these tanks. It would take 0.03% of their budget to take care of it. And just like businesses and government should be accountable, people have to be responsible. But our government seems to enjoy just the opposite and seems to enable it. In South Carolina, obesity kills the most South Carolinians, makes the most sick, and if prevented would save the state the most money in health care costs. And when I say health care costs, I mean Medicaid. While obesity is a personal responsibility and not any of the government's business, it becomes our business when we pay for food stamps on the front end, and then we pay for the Medicaid health care related costs of obesity on the back end. We're paying twice. In South Carolina alone, it is an $8.5 billion annual cost to us for obesity health care related costs. And finally, just like businesses, to get anything done, there has to be communication and common sense. Take the EPA. Every year they put $20 million in federal tax money into our state. Right now I have an account that has over $300 million that I can't spend and I don't need. I asked them if I could put it into the safe drinking. $50 million into safe drinking, they said, no, we can't transfer it. Can I give you back $300 million and you'll give me $50 million? Nope, the rules say no. Can I do anything to get the money where it needs to be? No. The rules say no. So it isn't just the unelected bureaucrat that keeps government from running like a business, it's the rules that we operate under. And where it gets dicey is when you have an agency head who wants to make reforms that make sense. And when it gets very dicey is when the laws and regulations are created in a vacuum. And you can't move money from one pot to the other, and you can't fix it. Now, Mallory, I have a how you can fix it, but I'm out of time. I have 3 pages of how you can fix it.
Okay, questions. Let's take some questions. Questions, okay.
So how do you think we can fix it?
I love you. That's great. So what if I told you that if you gave me $1 or if you gave me your money, trust me with it, which, by the way, you do it to the tune of $600 million a year, I could give you a 300% return on your money this year and a 1,000% return on your money within the next few years. You ever heard of predictive analytics? If you took the $20 billion with the B dollars that the Department of Treasury says they are going to lose in fraud at the IRS next year, that's 4 times, 5 times, 4 times. I can't do math. That is 4 times the Department of Energy's budget. I think they could fix our tanks. In obesity, if you took my $8.5 billion that we're spending on obesity, That is 5 times the budget that we need at the Department of Transportation in South Carolina to fix our infrastructure, and we'd still have $1 billion to play with. Predictive analytics.
Okay.
Is our Attorney General filing a lawsuit over the Savannah Riverside issue?
Not yet. What we have done is we've invoked the penalty. They have a stipulated $155 million penalty, and they've invoked ADR, Alternative Dispute Resolution. So we're in the process of figuring out how many different ways we can hit them on that. We offered them, from a business perspective, to take the penalty and put it back into the site to actually fix the tanks. And their response was, not only are we not fixing the tanks, but we'll take the penalty from SRS's budget. I love my job.
Please stand up.
Yeah, I have another question about SRS. I mean, clearly it's probably one of the most polluted sites on the planet, and it's, there's no secret that it's been poorly managed for many years. What can the state do, and what is the state doing to protect the workers at that site and the people in the Aiken area who live in close proximity to that site? I mean, I think this is a serious issue that is not getting the attention it needs.
I could probably speak in detail for hours on that, and we'll be glad to meet with you about that. But we do everything from check the milk that comes out of the cows and the fish that are in the water and tissue samples, to making sure that every worker that comes in and out doesn't have a radiation level that's too high. We have tritium forests that absorb into the trees the tritium. SRS has actually been managed well given the context of the rest of the complex.
Time for one more question.
Can you give us some kind of a report on the status of the port deepening? I know you folks are involved in that.
So right now, we are one of the people who permits the port deepening. It is ahead of schedule thanks to our last Corps engineer. Barbara Melvin at the port is currently, I don't know if it's been announced yet what depth. Has it been announced what depth we're going to get? Because if it hasn't, I'm not going to announce it myself. I think it's going to be fun. Right now, they're not having to put space cones in. They're not going to have the trouble that Georgia had, for example, with the oxygenation. So, I mean, it's ticking along really well, quickly, and I don't see any choke points.
We can take one more question, if there is one. One more question. Okay.
I'm in the industrial coatings business, and I'm glad you brought up the megavault, which they're building right now at Savannah Riverside. We had the contract to line the new megavaults. So if there is a leak, it will not get out in the soil. My contract was canceled because they felt like they didn't need to put the protective lining inside.
Again, why we need the money to clean it up. Yeah? Okay, thank you very much.
Okay. Congressman, come on up here and sit up here. Okay, I promise you no more comments about the Secret Service, but I gotta just do one. I gotta just do one more after this one. Okay, the Secret Service, as you know, is considering several new measures to keep people from trying to get into the White House. They figured it out, and they figured out a good way of doing it. The first thing they're going to do to keep people out is put up a sign that says Blockbuster Video. It was a long flight. It's the best I could do on it. Okay, no more Secret Service. Okay. Our next speaker is known to all of you in this room as District 110 representative in the State House. He's also a member of the South Carolina Transportation Infrastructure Bank, and tonight he's going to tell us more about this organization and what it's doing for South Carolina. And he's going to also talk a little bit about what's going on in the legislature. My friend, since I've been here, or even before I got here, let me introduce for I guess the third time speaking here over the past several years, Harry B. Limehouse. Chip.
Thank you, Mallory, and thank you all for being here tonight. I love it when I get in a room with this many Republicans. It makes me happy, and it makes me feel really right at home. Don't get to do this all the time in Charleston and in the legislature. So, and the great talk, Catherine, that you gave about what you've been doing in Columbia and the great job you've been doing. I think the depth of the port is going to be 50 feet, if I'm not certain, and that port deepening is probably one of the biggest economic success stories that we will have. And we all played an important role in that. And the small role I played as a state legislator is about 3 years ago we were doing the state budget, and we had our $180 million ready to go from the state, but the federal government had nothing, zero. And I even flew to Washington once with a group to meet with our congressional delegation, and they were trying, but still no money available. So when we sat down to do the state budget, I went to then Speaker Harrell, my good friend, then Speaker Harrell, I'll say my good friend, he is my good friend. And I said, Speaker, we have got to fund this 100% or it's not going to happen. And he said, you are correct. And he put his weight behind it, and we funded it 100%. So that port is 100% paid for by the state of South Carolina. We paid the federal portion. That was $80 million that they didn't have, and they gave the excuse that they couldn't get it through the committee process, but that was a lie. It was just they didn't want to come up with the money because Obama didn't want us to deepen our port. That's simple as it was for me. So the port got deepened, and here we are today. And I know, Mallory, you wanted me to talk about the State Infrastructure Bank, and that's something, it's not the red meat I wanted to come here. I wanted to trash Democrats for my whole 9 minutes. So that's not exactly what I wanted to talk about. Because I do like trashing Democrats, and they deserve it, and they need it. But as Republicans, we can't trash the Democrats and then fall and fail miserably on the job. We have to have, our job performance has to be better than Democrats. We can't say, you all vote for us and we have all the answers, and then we take office, and we've got this great conservative philosophy, but nothing ever happens. We're not going to do that. So that's why I'm particularly proud of the South Carolina State Infrastructure Bank. And the South Carolina State Infrastructure Bank is something that's near and dear to my heart because it was my legislation that helped create it. And why it's important is because the roads in South Carolina are falling apart. If you haven't driven around the state, take a drive around the state. How can we be, we have Charleston, the #1 city in the world. Did they drive here? I don't think so. I think they flew here when they gave us that designation. So in 1997, I offered the legislation that created the bank, and it's been working quite well ever since. The purpose was to allow us to build projects today at today's prices, because heretofore we had been doing the pay-as-you-go system. So pay-as-you-go meant we got all the money in place before we built anything. And then during the 20 years you were trying to get the money together, the project costs kept going up and up and up. So the Ravenel Bridge got built. That was one of the first major projects that we built with the State Infrastructure Bank money. And that was a project that probably never would have been built had the South Carolina State Infrastructure Bank not put $365 million into that project. And just a few more around the low country that you'll be familiar with, the $100 million we put into the Septima Clark Crosstown. And that's a great project. Another one that was dear to me because of the naval personnel that were killed in the bus accident in Gardens Corner was the widening of Highway 17 from Jacksonboro all the way down to I-95, and that was a project that I personally championed. And not only do we have the road safe for families to travel, but it's a great southern evacuation route for this city should we ever get another big storm. You know about Mount Pleasant. If you drive from the bridge out north of Mount Pleasant, you've seen the progress that we've made there, and that's pretty much most of that money came from the South Carolina State Infrastructure Bank. And the way we go about picking these projects, we don't just pick them out of a hat, and we don't just pick them using the P factor, the political factor. We pick them based on a criteria. And the primary criteria is that you have to have a local match. In other words, the State Infrastructure Bank doesn't come in and finance a property with a project with 100% of the cost. They say, how much locals, how much are you going to put up? Myrtle Beach has done a great job putting up a local match, and for just about every project they put up a local match. But that was the purpose of the project of the bank, is to get big projects moving really fast, and I think we've done that. We've done $5.2 billion in construction since the inception of the bank. And I'm very proud of the projects here in the Low Country because we've gotten more than, with 526, we've been the winners. Andre, you were there when we passed the legislation. Andre was a House member. People don't remember the Andre Bauer. Raise your hand, Andre. Everybody knows Andre. Stand up. Andre is now a resident of the city of Charleston. I think he lives right down the street. But he was in the House with me when we passed this legislation that created the South Carolina State Infrastructure Bank. And he was a good Republican then, and he's a good Republican now. So thanks for being here tonight, Andre. Sorry I had to put you on the spot. But there are 30 other state infrastructure banks around the country, and they've all modeled their infrastructure bank based on ours. So apparently we have the best one in the country, the infrastructure bank, and it's worked out quite well. Don Leonard from Myrtle Beach, he's the chairman. He does a great job. Does anybody here know Don Leonard? He's a good Republican too, and he likes to finance campaigns. So some of you candidates running here, he'd be a good one to know. But that's pretty much what I have on the State Infrastructure Bank. That's the projects we've done. That's the size of the bank. That's the purpose of the bank. South Carolina DOT is not equipped to pay for and handle the roads in South Carolina. We have about a $30 billion backlog right now in road construction. We have a 16 cents a gallon gas tax. And just recently, the new speaker, or speaker-to-be, Jay Lucas from Hartsville, South Carolina, he's a lawyer, and I want all of you all to get to know him. He's a good man. He's a lawyer from Hartsville, South Carolina. He appointed me to the Highway Infrastructure Ad Hoc Committee, which has been meeting every week in Columbia, and we are charged with coming up with a way to finance the crumbling road system in South Carolina. And we've been meeting every week, and it's been televised by ETV. It's been exciting stuff, but I didn't need to be on the committee to know what the problem is. The problem is money, like most problems. It boils down to money, Governor. And we don't, with the 16 cents a gallon gas tax, we're not going to be able to do it that way. So if anybody in this room knows how we're going to pay off that $30 billion backlog without raising the gas tax or any other way, I'd like to know how we're going to do it, because I think as a Republican and as a state legislator, I got to stand before you and say, I know I can run these roads, I know I can build these roads, and that's what we've been doing. But then the speaker and the new speaker also called me and said, oh, by the way, I'm also reappointing you to the State Infrastructure Bank. So I don't know if that was a good thing or a bad thing, but I've been reappointed to the State Infrastructure Bank, and here we are today. But I do want you all to meet Jay Lucas. He is one of us, and you'll like him soon. So I think we need to have him at one of these upcoming meetings, Mallory. And before I stop, I just want to recognize Mallory's work at the airport. He's a former airport commissioner. He stepped down voluntarily just recently so he could take up his new position in London. But Mallory, you did a fine job at the airport, and I thank you for all the work that you did there. I worked with you a lot during our tenure working together at the airport. We brought in 2 new airlines, Southwest and JetBlue, and as a result of that, you've seen the airfares start to drop, not to where we want to see them to be, but start to drop and go in the right direction. For a tourism city, we have to have low airfares. So that's pretty much what I have on the Infrastructure Bank, and we'll open the floor up for any questions you may have.
Okay, questions?
Representative, we know that government likes to name bills, and then the bill ends up doing the opposite of what it's supposed to do, like the Affordable Care Act. It's not affordable. But when it comes to ethics reform, the House and Senate, sometimes they'll say we're going to pass ethics reform. Do we see now the ramifications of Bobby Harrell's situation, that we will get real ethics reform in this state?
Well, let me just say about the Bobby Harrell situation. I think he is my friend, and I think he's been indicted, but he has not been convicted of anything. But be that as it may, we passed a great bill in the last legislative session for ethics reform, and it had reporting and every other thing that the public's been asking for. And I'm not here. Are there any state senators here? I see a sister of a state senator, but I don't see any state senators. The state Senate did not adopt the bill, and I wish they had, but I can tell you the House will pass another good bill this year. Next question in the back.
Are you going to make me walk all the way back again? Meet me halfway. Well, that's halfway. You must be a Democrat if that's meeting halfway.
That hurt my heart, Mallory. Certainly not. My question is about the roads. Could the problem be less about the money and more that South Carolina has more road miles per capita than any other state?
Yeah, that's a good point. I'm glad you made that point. We have over 48,000 lanes of roads in South Carolina, which is a large amount for a state our size. And that's because of state legislators in the past. When the state legislators really ran the state, they would pave roads in their district all the time. And that, they've left us with a huge road system that we're not equipped to maintain. So that's an excellent point, and you're correct. But I don't know, I've often talked about giving them to the counties, but they don't want to take them. So we're kind of stuck with that situation. Next question?
You said President Obama did not want the port deepened and did not allow.
I did say that.
Were you serious? Could you expand on that?
Well, I don't have proof of that, but I know when I went to Washington and I did the best I could to get the money, they said that they would have to have $240,000 to go in a special study committee, but they couldn't get the 240. It was actually the U.S. Senate, the Democrats running the U.S. Senate, so maybe I misspoke. Maybe I should say the Democrats in the U.S. Senate, but that's the way I feel. I don't have any proof of that. I can't prove it. Sorry if I hurt your feelings or Obama's feelings, but I stand by my statement. Any other questions? Thank you. No, is there one?
We have a couple more.
Okay.
I'd like to thank you for your service, but I found $535
Where are you?
million.
I hear you. I don't see you. Okay, there you are. Elizabeth, I should have known Elizabeth.
Yes. When you look at the state budget and what we do, when the General Assembly passed the EEDA, which most I think know is the Education Economic Development Act, we included 5 additional elective credits to graduate from high school when you really only need 19 to go to 4-year college. So those 5 additional elective credits, if you multiply out per pupil with 61,000 freshmen and 9,000 per pupil spending, you got $535 million. So I do agree with Ms. Templeton. You do need to run this as a business, and that makes no sense.
Okay, yes, I agree with you. Any other questions?
Keeping in line with that style of question, Chip, thanks for all the hard work you're doing in Columbia.
Thank you very much. I appreciate any help and support I can get, and it was a joy to be.
We got one more question.
Okay, one more. Sure, we'll take questions. I'm just trying to get the next speaker because I know we have 9 minutes. But yes, ma'am.
And when are you going to start doing what the legislative has written to give back the local government funds to the counties?
For what purpose? What funds?
The ones you're retaining that were the local government funds, you are keeping part of the.
Well, the local government funds are all state dollars, and what we choose to give back to the state is when we think they're doing a good job, we give them back. It's the local government funds approximately $80 million in our state budget, and Charleston County gets, I think, about $15 million of that $80 million. And every year when the county's not doing things that me and other legislators like to see them do, we put our foot on the local government fund and we hold it up, and then we get what we want to happen, usually to happen. So that's our chit that we always hold, and sorry, but that's the way we do it. I'm just telling you all the truth. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
This meeting would never have come off without the help of a few people. And I just have to recognize the one guy who really pulled this off. When I was over in the UK, I needed some help in organizing this. I made one call to Eddie Taylor, and he said, whatever you need, just you can count on me, and I'll do whatever it takes. And Eddie, come on, stand up. We need to really. Also, there's a couple of people. There's 3 people who were instrumental in helping put this together, and I just want to thank them. Well, more than 3, there's actually 4. One is Paul Witten from the Citadel, who used to be one of my students, and there's also Ethan Kindwall, who's president of Citadel Club. You want to stand up, Ethan? Where are you? And Eric Cochran, president of CSU's Republican Club, and Keith McCrae from the College of Charleston. These are the guys who helped us get this going and put it together, and I want to thank them. Let's have a big round of applause for them. Okay, no more Secret Service comments, but I will hit you with another one from something else. Okay, I don't know if you've been paying attention to what's going on with ISIS, but I mean, it's pretty serious. I don't know if you also know that Kim Cattrall, remember Kim Cattrall? She had an interview, and she said there's going to be another Sex in the City movie. An hour later, ISIS did surrender. There's only so much people can take. Okay, I told you the flight was not an easy flight over. Okay, so when we put the meeting together, the first call I made was to our own representative, Mark Sanford, who said, I have to be in Hilton Head, but if you're going to have all these people come, I want to be there to support the meeting and do what I can. He always has been supportive. He always wants to be supportive. And I am thrilled that he's here. You all know him. He served in Congress, and he served as governor, and now again in Congress. And tonight he's going to tell us really what's going on in Congress and what Republicans should be working on and doing for the next term. Let's have a big round of applause for Congressman Mark Sanford. Come on up, Mark.
Okay, Mallory, thank you. Pleasure. Indeed, back up from Hilton Head, and the drive was good. I'd say thank you for including me. Eddie, you're tireless. Everywhere I go around the district, Eddie was already there or is just on his way. Bobby, an honor to be in your company. Bobby and I did not overlap in Congress, but we did on the governorship, and he's just incredibly impressive. I think he's one of the real thought leaders of our party, and look forward so much to hearing your thoughts. Catherine, I'd hope to make it back from Hilton Head in time to hear your thoughts, and so I want you to give me the cliff notes afterward, all right? What I thought I might do is touch on 3 quick spending things and 1 on war, and then we'll call it quits. 1, I think that you ought to think about September 18th as being your financial Halloween. September 18th was the date of the last CR that just passed in the Congress. And I say financial Halloween because if you stop and think about it, a large part of what you thought you controlled in your federal government, you don't control. So think about the rough math as this. About 2/3 of your federal government is on automatic pilot, what they call entitlement spending, Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security. The other third has always been debated by the Congress. Domestic discretionary is what they call it, and a few other things. That third has been debated, but not so much lately. So I remember when I was first in Congress going down to the floor of the House of Representatives with Tom Coburn and literally offering 100 amendments to the Ag Bill, which was kind of overdoing it, as sort of a filibuster in the House, which you can't have. But in fairness to the system, you could offer your 2 cents and say, this, I think, is what people back home believe, and I'm going to try and convey that thought as best I can. Well, and I'm sure Bobby did the same thing in different amendments that he would offer there on the floor of the House of Representatives. Well, roughly for about the last 5 years, that process has gone out the window, and your government has been operating by CR and omnibus. CR is simply saying, let's take whatever we spent last year, and we'll spend it again this year. And can you imagine anything more disastrous in your business if you were to say, I'll tell you what we're going to do. We're going to take what we spent last year, and we're going to spend it again this year. I mean, that reshuffling of the deck is vital to making anything work. This area isn't working so well. Let's take some money out of this, and let's redeploy it into this area that's doing exceptionally well. That annual shuffling has not been taking place, and then these things get wrapped up into what's called an omnibus bill, which is a giant bill wherein there's no accountability because it gives anybody in elected office a reason to say, I voted for it or I voted against it because there are like 1,000 things in it. So what happened then was, fast forward to basically this last year, because the House and Senate couldn't get together on their budget categories, you were at this stalemate, so let's pass the Ryan-Murray budget, and what that'll do is it'll set us back to what we call regular order. Senate will be at one number, House will be at the other number. We'll finally begin to produce these 12 appropriation bills that are part of that yearly debate that we used to have on domestic discretionary. Well, that lasted all of about 6 months. Now, I want you to think about it. So the only piece of financial discipline in town was the sequester that went in place as a result of certain things not happening. The Ryan Murray budget was set up to say, all right, let's come up with a new way of skinning this cat, and it all went out the window with that CR that passed September 18th. And I think it has very, very scary implications in terms of the way your money gets managed in Washington, D.C., not just in the rest of this Congress, but in the next one going forward. That'd be point one. Point two, deficits aren't real, but they do matter. You may remember Vice President Cheney saying deficits don't matter. I think that what all of us would say in terms of conventional conservative wisdom would say, no, wait a minute, spending more than you're taking in absolutely does matter. Because a deficit is basically, the tab handed to the next generation is what it is. And there's certain moral contract that doesn't work if you're saying, well, we're going to spend it now. We'll enjoy the benefits of that, but we're going to hand the bill to somebody else. And so I want you to think about these numbers. 2014, in other words, the end of last year, debt was 16,719, right? Call it right around 17, just a little bit shy of $17 trillion, okay? We just ended the fiscal year September 30 this year, and the number is 17,633. The difference between those two numbers is 914 billion. Now here's the interesting part. You may have heard the president talk about deficits are coming down, deficits are coming down, deficits are coming down. The number that they use is 492, about half that number. But you would think, wait, if we have one debt number at the end of one year, and then you get to the end of the next year, and you've got a different, that difference is deficit, right? Not in Washington, D.C. It's about half that number. 2 points to this that are very, very important. I don't want to bore you with math, but it's really, really important. One is the deficits that we do have are being shielded by things that aren't going to last. So for Freddie and Fannie, after the financial crisis of 2008, federal government took them over, and they contribute about $100 billion a year to the federal government. Well, guess what? That isn't going to last forever. Another thing that happened was, the federal balance sheet, the Fed has ballooned its balance sheet from about, $800 billion to almost $5 trillion. Balloon. So as a consequence, it pays interest into the federal government, again, roughly about another $100 billion. So those things are shielding the numbers that we have. But when interest rates go against the Fed, those chickens do come home to roost, and you're going to see the numbers turn the other way. So our numbers are really, really scary because, one, they're being faked based on a low interest rate environment that's going to turn against us. And two, it really underscores, for instance, the importance of Iron Dome. Many people, I suspect, in this room were upset with me for voting against the Iron Dome funding. But what is important is I've already voted for it twice. I've been consistent in my support of Israel in my time before in Congress, my time now. But what we cannot continue to do is continue to game the process wherein a vote like Iron Dome, that they know is politically popular, is not offset, which means it's not including the deficit, and it just goes straight to that extra $400 billion of accumulated extra that really drives where our national debt's going. Same happened with the VA. If a vote's popular these days in Washington, it gets tucked to the side. They don't offset it, which means it ends up in that number that is not showing up in deficit, but is showing up in accumulated national debt, and we got a real problem on that front. Third point I would make is this. Reinhardt and Rogoff aren't crazy. Now, I don't know if you all remember them. That's the professor from the University of Maryland and the professor from Harvard who wrote a book entitled This Time It's Different. And they chronicle roughly the last 800 years of financial history, looking at governments, and what they found was that in every case, without exception, folks got to this sort of tripping point wherein they said, do we go back to what made us competitive and maybe a world power or a power in the first place, or do we stay on this happy but unsustainable cycle of upward government spending? And more often than not, they said, let's stick with the happy route because this time it's different. And what they go on to show in this book is it never was, and it never is, that math always works. And so I want you to just remember this number is coming at us not in our grandkids' time and not in our kids' time, but in our lifetime, because the operative number is 2025. What the budget numbers in Washington show is that by the year 2025, we'll only have enough money for interest and entitlements and nothing else. So forget the debate on domestic discretionary, forget the debate on defense, to forget the debate on so many categories of government, 2025. And if you believe that financial markets anticipate, which they always do, this crisis point is coming not 10 years from now, but I suspect earlier. This is coming at us really, really fast. To give you a sense of how fast it's compounding and coming in our direction, think about this. In the history of our republic, up until the presidency of George Bush, we'd accumulated $5 trillion in national debt. Okay? Roughly 200 years, $5 trillion ticker. During the Bush presidency, it went from $5 to $10 trillion. It doubled, just in one presidency. Now, we're one president later, here with the Obama presidency, we're scheduled to go, so it went from 200 years to get to 5, 8 years to go from 5 to 10, and now with the Obama presidency, it's looking like it's going to double again, because we're at 17, he's still got another 2 years yet left. We will go from 10 to $20 trillion in national debt. Einstein was once asked, what's the most powerful force in the universe? His reply was compound interest. This thing is coming at us, and I would just again remind you to really look carefully at votes like Iron Dome, veterans, and other things when they're not offset. Last point, well, we'll save the last point. We'll come back to war maybe during questions. Yes, sir.
Questions?
You brought up Iron Dome. The reason you gave was because you said it wasn't paid for in the budget. Israel was existentially threatened, and if it didn't have any more funds for Iron Dome, there was a possibility it was going to be destroyed. South Carolina is coming out with a license plate saying South Carolina stands with Israel. The next time Israel is existentially threatened, will you vote the same way?
I'll look at it as I'll look at any vote. I think it's important to recognize that if America is going to be a long-term ally to Israel, you got to look at more than the next 5 or 10 years. And if America is not in a strong financial position, then Israel's position in the Middle East is exceedingly precarious. And if you look at the existential threat to America, based on, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, when he was asked, what's the most serious threat to the United States of America, his reply was the national debt. It wasn't what's happening in some other place around the world, it was the national debt. And so what I would say is, on the votes like that, I completely concur that, is there a huge problem? Do we need to do something about it? Which is why I voted in favor of Iron Dome. But I think that you cannot do what is happening in Congress right now, which is the number I just tried to walk through, which is gaming the system. Which is to say, if it's politically popular, we're not going to bother paying for it because you look like you're against Israel, you look like you're against veterans, you look like you're against somebody that has a meaningful constituency behind it, and therefore then nobody's going to take the vote. But if you continue to do that, then we end up with exactly what we saw this year, which is $422 billion not being a part of the deficit, but being added to the national debt this year, which is at best confusing for people. Because they think, well, I thought the deficit was going down. I thought we were down to about $400 billion from about $1 trillion. I thought it's coming down. No, in fact, it was about $1 trillion this year because money was moved off budget, which is what happened with the Iron Dome. So my objection was not against Iron Dome. It was procedurally, how are we going to pay for Iron Dome in a way that doesn't cause us to, over the long run, not be able to support Iron Dome or Israel or a whole host of places around the world. Yes, sir.
Mark, would you give us some thoughts about the war?
Oh, okay, yeah. I was just, what I was going to say was, I would just ask everybody to really get exercised about this because where we're headed, if you're following Dempsey's comments, we're headed toward boots on the ground going back in the Middle East. We've had a 10-year experiment with boots on the ground. We've spent, over $1 trillion. We've had more than 6,000 soldiers killed. But more importantly, given the body armor of today, we've had over 50,000 that have come back with life-altering wounds. So what would have killed you in a past conflict, they now survive but they happen not to have a hand, an arm, a leg, etc. This has been a very costly conflict. And so I think it's important that we measure that cost prior to engagement. That's why the Founding Fathers were so deliberate in saying only Congress has the authority to declare war. And that's a fairly sacred provision. I mean, in its balance hangs life or death. In its balance hangs a whole host of different financial and life considerations. In its balance hangs, I mean, how allies are going to view us going forward. And so I think it's just, I mean, Republican and Democratic presidents, in fairness, alike have ignored that notion of looking for declaration. But I think it's really important as you have conversations with friends, cousins, or relatives around other parts of the country to say, look, let's have a debate as an American family on what we want to do or what we don't want to do, but let's not back end our way into this. And if it's not only declaration, if you look at what the administration's doing right now, the tie that they have to action is tenuous. It's beyond tenuous. What they have done in terms of the use of military force is to say, we're authorized because Congress 13 years ago gave to President Bush basically authorization for the use of military force in going after perpetrators of 9/11. The only problem with that is it was against the state of Iraq. We're actually working as an ally with Iraq against ISIS. And so, I mean, I don't think, and I think Bobby could comment on this further, but Congress doesn't give blank checks to, you know, multiple presidents as they succeed one another to say declaration is declaration, and yet the administration has been up saying, we think that document holds for the next 20 years. That is absurd. And so all I'm saying is I think we really need to have an earnest debate about what we want to do or what we don't want to do, but let's have that debate as opposed to backing into this thing, which is what we're in the process of doing.
Next question.
Mark, thanks for your service. You've mentioned before in previous conversations, you didn't speak of it specifically tonight, but one of the things you've mentioned before is that a 10-year time horizon is too far, but maybe 5 years down the road, we may find ourselves in a position where we're in a period of extreme inflation, and you've mentioned the numbers, maybe 25, 30% inflation. What really makes you think that we're going to be at that point?
I think that a look at history, I mean, I go back to the Reinhard Rogoff book. I go back to a lot of other examples. It's the easiest way out. And I think oftentimes what people look for in any political seat is the easiest way out. And so I think, you know, I mean, there are only three ways out. I mean, you're going to have to raise taxes substantially, you're going to have to continue to borrow a bunch more, or you're going to have to cut substantially, or you run deficit. But at some point, there's less of an appetite for our ability to sell bonds around the world than there is now, and I think we're approaching that, at which point interest rates would go up to attract, you know, folks in buying what would amount to fairly risky debt. If you look at, you know, there's this guy, Lawrence Kotlikoff, up at the University of Boston. He's done a study on a thing called generational accounting. And what he points to is that the imputed tax rate for a kid born into America today is around 80%. In other words, we're never going to get there. That's not that far from slavery. But the reality is something's going to break between now and when we get there. I suspect it's inflation. Thank you for letting me be with you. Sure appreciate it. Thanks.
Okay, I'm going to share with you, I never do this, I'm going to share with you two comments. The first comment I'm going to share with you, I was reading an article on the plane heading over here about how the federal prison population dropped by almost 5,000 people. I was also reading another article right after it. So I've concluded that it's expected to go back up once the NFL season ends. Think about that. Think about that. It's okay. And the last one is I want to share with you that the United States, as you all know, has launched some major airstrikes against ISIS. The White House code name is Operation Approvals Rating. For those of you who want to hear some of these talks, they'll be on the web. They're being streamed out to a whole bunch of organizations. I don't know if Pelican Pelican Institute in Louisiana was going to carry it. I'm not sure they're carrying it on their website, but I know they want it. So a lot of, all over the country, people are watching this, and actually 2 organizations in the UK are also interested in carrying it. But our next speaker, and I'm going to ask him the first question. I'm going to take host prerogative, and he knows what that question's probably going to be after he's done talking. I'm going to put him on the spot, and he probably won't admit anything. But I'm pleased to have the opportunity to really welcome our next speaker. I've known him for a long time. He is truly the education guy of all the people I know in politics. He is about as much Mr. Education as anybody else. I'm going to share with you a really dumb story. But I had a little girl. I have a little girl. I have 3 little girls. But I had a little girl who was in nursery school, and she was doing a project where she had this little flat Samantha, you know, the flat Sams, and I was talking with our next speaker, and I told him, I said, give it to me. I'll take pictures wherever I go and send it back, so she can know about all these different places. And here's a guy who's busy but takes the time to help a little girl, or volunteers to take. I actually told him not to do it, but he volunteers to take the time to help a little girl study about geography by agreeing. And he goes on to say, the reason I'm going to do it is because education, K through 12 education, is really the major issue in our society. If we don't solve that, our society as we know it will end. And I'm probably not quoting him, but those are his sentiments. He's the governor of Louisiana, as you all know, impressive as can be. He has a terrific background in public policy. He was a scholar at Brown University and a Rhodes Scholar. I was with the warden of New College, which is a college that was started in 1379, I think. That's the New College in Oxford. That's true. And he's saying, no, he's not at the Rhodes House. He was a Rhodes Scholar. He's one of our people. I mean, everybody's claiming him in Oxford as their graduate because he is one of the most knowledgeable, one of the most admirable, and one of the actually nicest people you will ever get to meet. It gives me a great deal of pleasure to introduce Governor Bobby Jindal.
Thank you all very, very much. Thank you. Mallory, thank you for that very generous introduction. Mallory's been a great friend for many years. You know, Mark, you and I probably shared this experience when you're in elected office. I actually lost my first campaign running for office. And people ask me, what's the difference between losing and winning an election? And I tell people, you've got a lot more friends when you win an election than when you lose an election. I remember when I had won, there was a state official in my state who would publicly endorse my opponent. He'd gone and worked for my opponent. He'd been on TV for my opponent. He'd attacked me publicly. When I won, he came to see me. He said, Bobby, I was secretly for you from the very first day. So, you know, I'm new to politics. I said, next time I want you to be publicly for me. Secretly, you be for the other guy all you want. Mallory's been a great friend even before I was elected to governor. He's been publicly and privately, in any way, a great friend to me and a great leader for your state. So I'm honored to be here with you. It was such a great honor to hear the speakers before me. You know, as we were visiting, Catherine goes, well, you know, the good news is at least Mallory's not ripping off anybody's jokes. You know, he's writing his own jokes. And I thought that was pretty kind. Chip, we've got some of the same issues in our legislature and some of the same challenges y'all face, and so it was great to get your update. Mark and I were colleagues together as governor. I'll tell you just real quickly, one of my fondest memories was in November, my first year as governor, President Obama had just been elected, had not yet been sworn in, and met, Mark, I don't know if you remember, he met with all the governors up in Philadelphia in Constitutional Hall, this historic setting. He had this incredible approval rating, and everybody was so excited to meet the new president-elect. He hadn't done anything yet, and everybody had great hopes he was going to change the culture of D.C. and be this new guy. I hadn't voted for him, and Mark hadn't voted for him, but we all went there, you know, thinking this was going to be this bipartisan kumbaya. He got up and he spoke. He'd already said that he was going to address health care, so he kind of had a fear of what was coming. And I can't quote, and I can't even paraphrase because he did it so beautifully. Mark got up. There was a question and answer period for the governors with the new president. And Mark got up, and again, I wish somebody had recorded it because it sounded like it was the nicest, most sincere, most complimentary statement to the new president. But when he was finished, he basically just knifed him in the back in the nicest possible way. And I just remember thinking, boy, that was good. I don't know how he did that, and he did it with a pleasant smile, and he sounded so great. You know, in Louisiana, I think it's true in South Carolina as well. You know, whenever we say something really bad about somebody, and it's a Southern thing, we'll say, you know, God bless his soul, as if that makes it okay. You can call him whatever you want as long as you put that at the end of your statement. I thought about what I wanted to share with you, and there is a lot, and you've heard from the previous speakers, so much of what concerns us in our country today. Like Mark, I do worry about now almost $18 trillion of debt. Like Mallory, I've got young children. I worry about the future we leave ahead of them. I worry about Obamacare. I worry about this president's mess of a foreign policy. I worry about the regulations coming out of the EPA that could smother our economy. I worry about so much that this president is doing every single day. A lot of that can be reversed with conservative leadership in D.C. The thing that worries me the most, the thing that troubles me the most, is what this president is doing to redefine the American dream. He's doing it by rhetoric. He's doing it by his actions. If you listen carefully, if you watch his policies, what you see is a president who's intent on redefining the American dream to being a dream that's defined by dependence on government. It involves a larger, more expensive, more intrusive federal involvement in our daily lives. You hear this president talk about class warfare, dividing us by gender, by geography, by race. You hear a president talk about redistribution. I don't know about you, but that is not the American dream my parents taught me. My parents taught me about an American where our country is forever young. An American dream where you're not guaranteed equality of outcomes, you are guaranteed equality of opportunity. Where the circumstances of your birth don't determine your outcomes as an adult. You don't have to be born in the right neighborhood, the right zip code, the right parents, the right gender, the right race to do great things in this country. How many generations of American parents have told their little kids, you could be the first in our family to go to school. You could be the first in our family to start a business. You could be the first in our family to become a doctor, a farmer, a lawyer, whatever it is you dream of being. Indeed, I joke, how many moms have told their little boys and girls, anybody can grow up to become president of the United States. Now, unfortunately, we find out how true that was in 2012 and 2008. Before that, but we have got to fight to preserve that American dream for our children. The reason I'm so passionate about it, my parents lived. My dad's 1 of 9. Grew up in a house without electricity, without running water. Was the only one that got past the 5th grade in our family. I know because we heard those stories every single day growing up. You try to ask a dad like that for an allowance, good luck. All I heard was he wanted to charge me room and board if I was going to get paid an allowance. Here's the amazing thing about my parents. Nearly 50 years ago, my mom and dad, my mom's pregnant with me, my dad, who has finally gotten his education, they come halfway across the world so that my mom could go to school at LSU in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Now, they came legally, by the way, when they came to this country, but they came to this country nearly 50 years ago. But here's what's amazing to me. They had never gotten on a plane. There was no internet. There was no cell phones. It was expensive to travel. They never even met anybody who had been to Louisiana. They couldn't ask somebody, what is the weather like? What's the food like? What are the people like? What's it like in this strange place halfway across the world? But they knew in their bones there was a special place called America. My dad just knew in his bones if you could get there and if you were willing to work hard, you could do great things for your children, your grandchildren. You could have a better quality of life. There was freedom and there was opportunity in this special place. So my parents get here, and I love what my dad does next. They're in student housing, running out of money. My dad didn't come here to get on a government program. He wanted a job. So he does what he knows to do. He doesn't know anybody. He opens the yellow pages, and he starts calling companies looking for work. And I love this story because I don't know how long it took him. I don't know if it was days, weeks. I don't know how many hours he was on the phone. I don't know how many people slammed the phone down on him, laughed in his face, and rejected him. But he was running out of money. He had to feed his pregnant wife, so he kept calling and calling and calling. And then finally, he convinces a guy from a railroad company, sight unseen, to take a chance on him. The guy says, I'm so impressed by your desire to work, you can start work Monday morning. I love what my dad tells his new boss. Hasn't even met the guy yet. You have to meet my dad to understand this. Tells his new boss, that's great. He says, now look, I don't have a car. I don't have a driver's license. Tells his new boss, you're going to have to pick me up on the way to work Monday morning. The guy was so impressed by his desire to work, he did that. 6 months later, I was born. I was what you would now politely call a pre-existing condition. Now, they were married. I didn't predate the marriage. I don't want you to get the wrong idea. But there was no Obamacare, and their insurance didn't cover me, and I love what my dad did next. My dad just went to the doctor. He didn't fill out any government forms. There was a government hospital down the road where you could have gone called Charity Hospital. But instead, he went to Women's Hospital, where 2 of our kids would later be born many years later, went to the doctor at Women's Hospital, shook hands with the doctor, and said, I will send you a check every month until I pay this bill in full. No contract, no government programs, 2 guys, a doctor and a father, just shaking hands in a hospital. When my kids were born, we had Blue Cross. It took us hours to fill out the insurance forms at the same hospital. But you know, it was a simpler time back then. I asked my dad, how would that work today? How do you pay for a baby on layaway? I mean, now think about that. If you skip a payment, can they take the baby back? What does the hospital do? I mean, they send an ambulance? And he tells me, no, look, son, you're paid for. Don't worry about it. He said, you're such a bad little kid. We would have skipped a payment if they would have taken you back. But he goes, no, we paid your bill. I tell you that because growing up, my dad, you know, Mark Twain said that our parents, the older we get, the smarter our parents become. And as I've gotten older, I find myself, I don't know about you, I've turned more and more into my dad. And I hate it. I say things to my kids I swore I would never say when I was a little boy. My dad used to tell me, well, son, you don't live in a democracy. As long as you live under my roof, you live under my rules. This is a dictatorship as long as you're living at my roof. I hate it when he said that. I say that to my kids all the time. My dad used to tell me, now, son, if your friends jumped off the bridge, would you jump off a bridge? Had no idea what it meant, hated it back then. I say it to my little kids all the time today. But there was something else my dad would tell us as well. He'd say, now, sons, I'm not giving you a famous last name. I'm not giving you an inheritance. I will make sure you get a great education. Because if you work hard, there's no limit on what you can accomplish in this country. But he used to also tell us this. He'd say, every night you should get on your knees and thank God Almighty that you are blessed enough to be born in the greatest country in the history of the world, the United States of America. You know, I'll be honest, I really didn't understand all that he was trying to teach me, but now that I've got kids, I do understand what he was trying to teach me. This is a special place. And we should never take it for granted. There are several things we can do to preserve that American dream for our children and grandchildren. I want to share with you just 4 real quickly. You know, I formed an organization called America Next. I think Mark and the others have spoken before me are exactly right. We can't just be the party of no. We can't just be the party that says we're anti-Obama on everything. I oppose this president a lot. I've sued him over Common Core to stop that spread throughout our country. I called for Eric Holder to step down over Fast and Furious years ago. I have gone and I went to D.C. and called this president cynical, immoral, and hypocritical for suing my state over our school choice programs. I'm not getting invited back to the White House, by the way, under this president, but I have stood against this president time and time again, but we as a conservative movement, as Republicans, need to also show what we are for and how our path is better, how our ideas are better. 4 simple areas. And America Next is articulating detailed policies. The first, as Mallory hinted at, was education. And with education, it's pretty simple. What we've done in Louisiana, what I recommend we do across this country is pretty simple. We've done a lot of things. But it really boils down to this. Instead of making the child follow the dollar, let the dollar follow the child. Trust parents to make the best decisions about how their children should be educated. We've done that in Louisiana. 90% of our kids are in charter schools in New Orleans. We've got homeschoolers. We've got kids going to private schools with our scholarship dollars. We've got kids who go to public school part of the day, private school the rest of the day. We've got all kinds of programs. The point is this. Every child learns differently. The second thing, Yes, we need to repeal Obamacare, but we also need to replace Obamacare. We put out a 16-point plan on how you actually lower health care costs. Remember that promise? Premiums were going down $2,500 by the end of his first term. Remember, you could keep your doctor, you could keep your health care plan. Now, nobody wants to go back to the health care system the way it was exactly before Obamacare, but Obamacare has only made things worse. We don't need bureaucrats between doctors and their patients. Third, we put out a plan a couple of weeks ago called The Path Towards Energy Independence. America has been blessed. We've got a tremendous opportunity. And of course, I'm for oil and gas. I come from the state of Louisiana, but I'm for all of the above. And the reality is we've got an opportunity with affordable energy to bring good-paying manufacturing jobs back into this country. Let's be honest about what the left really wants. The left wants energy to be scarce. They want it to be expensive. The reason they want that is it gives one more excuse for the federal government to be involved in our lives. I went to D.C. and I called the president a science denier. The reality is by exporting energy-intensive manufacturing jobs overseas, all we're doing is actually hurting the environment. That next big steel mill gets built in Brazil. That next big production facility goes to China. That is more pollution in the air because their regulations are looser than ours, and that's fewer good-paying jobs right here at home for American workers. You know, if we just harness the energy available to us, we could increase median income by 7%. We could create 2 million manufacturing jobs. The president talks about stimulus. Here's a stimulus plan that doesn't involve federal spending, federal borrowing, doesn't involve more debt. Simply involves us taking advantage of our own energy. We can create a North America energy supermarket, superpower, where we're actually energy independent. How ironic. Mexico and Canada are moving towards a free market approach to energy just as America is moving the other direction. And then fourth and finally today, literally today, and we'll be talking about this at the Citadel tomorrow, and I'm excited about that great honor and opportunity. Great institution. We've got some of the students here today. We've been unveiling, and I'll be unveiling tomorrow specifically, a plan in terms of restoring America's defense. Under this president, we've hollowed out our military. You know, a few weeks ago, the president admitted what we all knew. He said he had no coherent strategy when it comes to defeating ISIS. It wasn't a verbal gaffe, it was actually the truth. But you know what? This president doesn't have a coherent foreign policy. Then everybody got mad because on Friday, Vice President Biden started insulting the few allies we've got left in the Middle East. It's not a gaffe. This president has spent 6 years insulting our allies, whether it's Great Britain, Israel, or any other country that had the temerity to stand with us. This president does not believe in American exceptionalism. Up until 2012, when I was campaigning to try to deny this president a second term, I used to go around the country saying, President Obama was the worst president since Jimmy Carter. After the re-election, I went to D.C. and I actually publicly apologized to Jimmy Carter. I think that was a bit unfair. I see my time is up. I'll end with 2 sentences and then take your questions. The first sentence is this. This president does not believe in American exceptionalism, does not understand a stronger America leads to a more peaceful and stable world. My final sentence is this. For all the problems I've outlined for you today, I still think my dad is right. I'm still an optimist that we are blessed to live in the greatest country in the history of the world. It is not preordained or inevitably so. It is up to this generation to do what every generation has done before us. It is now our turn to choose for ourselves to renew the principles of freedom as our 40th president warned us we must do so our children can do what we were taught to do by our parents. And thank God Almighty, we were blessed to be born in the greatest country in the history of the entire world. Thank you all very much for allowing me to come speak to you. Thank you all very much. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you all. Thank you all very, very much.
Okay, host prerogative. First question.
I bet you it's about Cambridge versus no, I'm just teasing.
You know what it's going to be. Are you going to be seeking the Republican nomination for the presidency of the United States?
Well, a couple of thoughts about that. First, I will certainly, it is something I'm thinking about, I'll be honest. My wife and I are thinking about it. We are thinking and praying about it. You know, it's funny, I got actually attacked, of all things, who would have thought this is how far we've gone. One of the things I didn't talk about today that I look forward to talking about in the future is religious liberty. I think it's a huge issue in our country. And I told a reporter we were thinking and praying about this, and he attacked me for saying I was praying about it. And I said, I don't know how you would make a big decision without prayer. To me, that is just commonsensical. It is something we're thinking about praying. We won't make that decision before November. We've got a lot of elections we need to win in November. We've got to re-elect your governor, Nikki Haley, here in South Carolina. We've got Tim Scott and Lindsey Graham we need to re-elect to the United States Senate as well. Mark doesn't even have an opponent. I never ran unopposed. He doesn't even have an opponent. So we've got to keep our majority. Yeah, you can give him a round of applause for that. He's already won his re-election. We've got, I'm not going to repeat that. He's got, we've got, you can elbow him, Mark, it's all right. We've got to retire Harry Reid. We've got a lot of important elections we got to win in November. I'll make that decision sometime after the holidays, but I will tell you this. One of the things I've sensed, because I've been traveling the country helping especially gubernatorial candidates, but other candidates as well, one of the things I sense is there's a great frustration in this country. I think there's frustration not only in the Democratic Party, but also in the Republican Party. People are ready for a hostile takeover of D.C. Here's one of my great concerns, and I hope we retire Harry Reid. One of my great concerns is we take the majority this November and then nothing changes. Because people will be just as mad as Republicans as they are at Democrats if after we get the majority, it's business as usual. Remember this, President Obama only had the Senate and the House for 2 years, got the stimulus done, got Obamacare did more to advance progressivism than any president in a very long time. President Bush had the Senate and the House for 6 years. What are the lasting conservative changes we can point to? And I've got a lot of respect and admiration for the president, don't get me wrong, for President Bush, but what are the conservative principles we can point to and say, that's what got done in the 6 years we had the majority. So I hope we take the majority, but then I hope we do something with it after November.
Next question.
First, if you could extend my regards to the Robertsons next time you're with them.
I will.
But one thing that is really attracting young people like myself is privacy. How do you feel about the NSA and certain civil liberties?
Sure. Well, two things. One, first on the Robertsons, I'll tell you, one of the reasons I stood up for Phil and the Duck Dynasty family is I'm tired of the hypocrisy of the left. They're for tolerance and they're for respect unless you happen to disagree with them. And I took my kids to see the show. You know, they actually allowed me to be in part of one. They've been friends for a number of years. 364 days of the year, my kids think that Daddy does a very boring job as governor. That one day, they actually thought Daddy did something interesting. When it comes to the NSA and privacy, look, I think this president, under this president, we have seen abuses of federal power none of us thought we would ever live to see. I'll be honest. I'm not a guy that's naturally conspiratorial-minded, but if you had gone back in 6 years, 7 years ago and told me, do you really believe this would have happened, I would have been shocked. But every time we see a new revelation, it's almost this, every time you think you can't get any worse, it does. So literally under the Department of Justice, now think about some of the abuses of government power we've seen in this administration. We've seen guns provided to Mexican drug cartels in Fast and Furious. We have seen the IRS go after conservative groups for their political beliefs. We've seen the Department of Justice spy on AP reporters. We have seen scandal after scandal throughout this entire administration, and there's no accountability. We've seen a president who ignores the law, chooses which parts of the Constitution he wants to obey, when he wants to obey it, when he's implementing Obamacare, when he's releasing prisoners, when he's doing prisoner swaps with the Taliban. Time and time again, just when you think, well, they couldn't possibly do any worse, something new comes out. So I think that we are rightfully skeptical of a broad government power. I think that we are rightfully skeptical on the abuse, the potential abuse, and the actual abuse of the government's powers to intrude into our private lives. I absolutely want our government to fight, be able to fight and win the war on terrorists. I do think there's an important line between what our government does overseas and what it does here domestically at home to American citizens. So I think we're right to be skeptical of the government. I think we need to ask tough questions. I'm not a big proponent. Mark and I both served in Congress. I'm not a big proponent one of the things I actually wrote in my book was I think we should pay Congress on a per diem basis, except we should pay them for every day they stay out of D.C. rather than every day they go to D.C. I think there's a lot of mischief that happens. Mark Twain said your wallet's safest when the legislature is out of session. But one of the things I think Congress does need to be doing more of is providing more oversight to this government. I think the executive branch has run amok under this administration. So I think you're absolutely right to be worried about our privacy rights, our liberty rights here at home. And I'll be honest with you, 6, 7 years ago, if you'd come to me and predicted how bad this administration would be, I don't know if I would have believed it. I would have said, oh, you're making that up. It couldn't possibly get that bad, even under a Democratic president. I hate to admit it, this president has proven time and time and again, just when we thought it couldn't get any worse, it does. And they continue to break our trust. Every time you want to try to give them the benefit of the doubt, something else new happens, and you realize, well, maybe it is as bad as we always thought it was when you look at all the abuse of government power. So absolutely, I think you're right to be worried about that.
Next question.
Today at AEI, you mentioned about that the United States military should not be nation builders or building democracy, which I completely agree with. But what should conservatives do about supporting organizations like NED, IRI, as well as private organizations that go and work with center-right parties throughout the world?
Sure, a couple of things. One, and I did give, and I'll be again talking at the Citadel tomorrow about the role of the military. And one of my points was that you don't fund your military for domestic political concerns. You don't fund your military for Keynesian economic development. You fund your military because you want to protect your country. It's actually the first most important role that's actually described in the Constitution for the federal government. It's the one thing that the Founding Fathers said the federal government has to do, is actually have to protect our country. When it comes to the so-called soft powers, the soft tools of diplomacy, two things. One, when it comes to funding groups overseas, just because something is good and something ought to be done doesn't necessarily mean the federal government has to do it. And I think that's something we have got to rediscover in this country. And that was part of the rationale behind earmarks. That was part of the rationale behind all these out-of-control federal spending. People would argue, well, these are good projects. Well, they may be good projects. That doesn't mean that our federal tax dollars should be doing those things. The Founding Fathers didn't intend for the Congress, for the federal government to be doing anything and everything for us. And there's a reason there's a 10th Amendment to the Constitution. So one, I think we do need to be looking more towards private funding, charitable funding, trust funding for a lot of activities the government does today. Secondly, I do think there are soft tools of diplomacy that can be used to complement our military strength. And one of the things I said at AEI today, for example, Ronald Reagan built up the Pentagon and therefore deterred Russian then Soviet aggression. At the same time, he gave moral and other encouragement to freedom movements in Eastern Europe. Not slush funds, not politically wasteful spending, not just money that was given out to dictators, but actually to help encourage folks who are standing up to regimes that were hostile to the United States and help to advance American interests without putting American troops in harm's way. So I'm not going to stand up here and say that there's never a reason to use soft power. There are times where using the soft tools, the soft powers of diplomacy and democracy are very appropriate. And I think Reagan's example of funding these pro-democracy, pro-freedom groups, movements in Eastern Europe at that time was a great example, and there may be analogous examples today. The problem has been that too often we see State Department dollars, we see foreign aid dollars, we see a lot of American dollars going to dictators, funding groups that are counter to American interests without any accountability. So I think there is an appropriate role, but I think it has to be overseen, and I don't think that everything that's good needs to be funded by the federal government. I think there are a lot of things that are good that the federal government should have nothing to do with. Quite often there are state or local responsibilities. Other times they're the private sector's responsibilities.
Peggy Noonan had an excellent op-ed piece in the last couple of days about the bureaucrats in Washington at the hearings and how they don't make any pretense anymore of answering questions, answering them honestly. They look bored. They're certainly not worried about losing their jobs. How do we reverse this?
That's a great question. Two things. One, I think we need a lot fewer of them. In Louisiana, we have cut 28,000 state government jobs since I've been elected governor. But secondly, and I don't say this glibly, I say this sincerely. I'm not as just a Republican, as a conservative, as an American citizen, I'm offended by what the IRS has done and how they have politicized the system, the tax system, and what are supposed to be sacred trans-political rights and duties. I think it'd be helpful for a couple of folks at least to go to jail. I think it'd be helpful to set an example. I mean, the earlier question about the NSA, for example, anytime somebody is found, remember the NSA, this is now kind of forgotten. There were government employees found to be using the government's powers to go and look up old girlfriends or to go spy on people. You know, why hasn't somebody at the very least lost their jobs, lost their pensions? I think there need to be serious consequences for these bureaucrats that are abusing the powers that are given to them. You heard an excellent presentation on the power of the unelected bureaucrats. So much of that power is not just on the handful of elected officials. I wouldn't mind a few elected officials going to jail, but that's a whole other story for another day. I think if you sent a couple of those bureaucrats to jail, or at the very least took away their jobs, their pensions, their protections, their retirements, I think that would certainly send a strong signal to the rest of the government. Well, I know my time is up. Let me just say this. This is an important election. We're all frustrated with President Obama, and I cannot wait to call him the former president of the United States. But absolutely, we can't do anything about that in November. What we can do is stop calling Harry Reid majority leader. Let's go out and vote this November, and let's make some positive changes this November. Thank you all very much.
Governor Jindal. Thank